Good evening. My name is Amy Sapenoff, and on behalf of the Crossroads Cultural Center, welcome to the 4th annual Luigi Giussani series on faith and modernity. An immediate thank you is warranted to the Sheen Center for helping to organize this event, which each year is an important moment to further discover the ongoing relevance of Father Giussani in our current cultural and social milieu. To introduce this evening's discussion, we'll first watch a short video about Father Giussani's life.
The fundamental question for the human person, for any person, in any time until the end of history, ever since the message that God became man, was brought, entered the world, the greatest question of life is this. No greater question is conceivable. That is, the human person cannot imagine a greater question for his freedom. Christ, yes or no?
Luigi Giussani was born on October 15, 1922, in the town of Desio, in the Lombardy region of Italy. His father, Beniamino, was an artisan with sympathies for the socialist cause, who passed on to his son a thirst for justice and a passion for reason. From his mother, Angelina, young Luigi received the gift of a deep-seated and well-educated Catholic faith. His love for learning and culture were evident when Luigi entered the seminary at the age of 10. Years later, following his ordination, Father Giussani was assigned to teach theology, but a chance meeting with a group of young people marked a new course in his life. This encounter convinced him that the experience of Christian faith was becoming detached from the experience of daily life and was reaching a crisis point.
And then I left to devote myself, through teaching religion in public schools, to the attempt to communicate religion in a way that would be more easily acceptable to young people. Going up the steps of Berchet High School, I asked myself, what am I coming here to do? I come here to give these kids the opportunity to know what I have known, because why should I have known and felt the reasons, and them not? Then freedom will show the road ahead as it wills. The Lord says, whoever follows me will have eternal life, and 100-fold here below. And I used to say in class, if you do not desire eternal life, I understand you, because you don't have much imagination. But if you do not desire the 100-fold here below, then you are fools.
Though Giussani hadn't planned to start a new church movement, he understood that his charism truly was a continuation of Christ's presence in history, and was thus an answer to contemporary humanity's desire for truth, beauty, justice, and happiness.
We, like everyone else, want a better humanity, but it is not possible for humanity to love better by itself, alone, with only its projects, its fantasies, and its energies. This is what we want to say with the term communion and liberation. It is only the communion that God made possible himself through Christ. It is only in the communion among men who recognize this that, in expanding itself, creates oases of truer humanity.
Father Giussani was filled with wonder as he saw communion and liberation communities spring up across the globe, generating new cultural initiatives and charitable works. CL can now be found in more than 90 countries on every inhabited continent. As the movement grew and matured, Giussani continued to remind its members that their primary task was to acknowledge and announce the fact of God's saving mercy made present in Christ.
The mystery as mercy remains the last word, even on all the awful possibilities of history. For this reason, existence expresses itself as ultimate ideal in begging. The real protagonist of history is the beggar. Christ who begs for man's heart, and man's heart that begs for Christ.
il cuore dell'uomo mendicante di Cristo.
Father Giussani died in February 2005, just days before the passing of his dear friend, Pope John Paul II. At Giussani's funeral, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger captured the essence of this humble Milanese priest, whose passion for Christ had impacted so many. Father Giussani was touched, or better, wounded, by the desire for beauty. He was not satisfied, however, with just any ordinary beauty, with beauty, however banal. He sought rather beauty itself, infinite beauty. And thus, he found Christ.
So tonight's topic of education is of particular and personal significance to me, as I am myself an educator. However, my life as a teacher exists in two very different contexts. First, as a high school history and government teacher in a distinctly non-Catholic school in Potomac, Maryland, and second, as one of the principal coordinators of GS in the United States. GS stands for Gioventù Studentesca, or Student Youth. Originally, GS was the group, which referenced in the video we just watched, that was established by Father Giussani himself after beginning his own career as a teacher in response to his desire to help young people overcome the perceived gap between faith and daily life. GS communities exist as part of the presence of communion and liberation and the enduring legacy of Father Giussani in the United States today. It has only been with the help of Father Giussani that I can understand the deep connection between my experience both inside the classroom with my students and with the high school students who participate in GS and that I meet with on a weekly basis. There are two constitutive elements in Giussani's understanding of education: human development and an awareness of the world. Education, then, is best defined as an introduction into total reality. In his book, The Risk of Education, Father Giussani supplements this definition by saying, "The word reality is to the word education as destination is to a journey." As a teacher, there is a promise in these words. Helping my students to pay attention to a particular piece of reality, in my case, American history, is the first step in accompanying them as they discern the depth of their own existence. It is at least partially through the discovery of the world and all that is given to us in our daily life that human development is achieved. But education is not merely a matter of acquiring information. There is a wide gap between reality as we perceive it and arriving at life's ultimate meaning. For a true education to take place, young people have to be given the tools to understand that information, to look at the world and make sense of it in light of their own questions and humanity. They must be given a method. Giussani likens the method of education to a student receiving a backpack filled with various tools to help them along their path. I invite you now to watch another clip about Giussani, where he himself describes this more. Please note that you received both the DVD and the transcript of this talk in your program.
Perché, dico sempre ai giovani, che l'uomo nasce con una delle due famose bisacce di Esopo dietro le spalle. E in questa bisaccia che sta dietro le spalle, lo spunto da Esopo è puramente esterno, di immaginazione esterna. In questa bisaccia genitori e chi per essi, chi vuol il bene del bambino, mettono dentro tutto quello che credono opportuno. E questo è giusto, come abbiamo detto prima, perché è naturale. Ma a un certo punto la stessa natura, in nome della quale si dà al proprio figlio quello che sembra più giusto, la stessa natura spinge il bambino, il ragazzo oramai, ad afferrare la bisaccia che sta dietro le spalle e a buttarsela di fronte alla faccia per guardarci dentro. buttare di fronte alla faccia si dice, si indica con una parola italiana che deriva dal greco, la parola problema, gettato davanti. E rovistare dentro per vedere se la questione vale o no deriva ancora viene indicata da una parola italiana che deriva ancora dal greco, la parola crisi, che la parola crisi o critica significa cogliere le ragioni, rendersi conto delle ragioni e perciò dei limiti e dei non limiti di una proposta. Ma senza abituare a questo lavoro, senza compiere la fatica di abituare a questo lavoro, l'educando cresce reattivamente, con la reattività come ultimo criterio, reattività psichica o reattività mentale, però questo processo, se l'adulto in qualche modo non l'ha fatto, non l'ha compiuto, o in occasione del figlio non impara lui a compierlo, e come farà ad aiutare il figlio? In questo senso la libertà entra in gioco. Innanzitutto la libertà entra in gioco nella figura dell'educatore. Veramente la libertà innanzitutto è entrata in gioco nell'atteggiamento che l'educatore assume di fronte al passato. Come è triste una società in cui nessuno veramente si dà da fare o si desse da fare per difendere la possibilità di comunicare l'eredità alle creature nuove che emergono, perché dai giornali alla televisione alla scuola tutto può creare un sipario e un coibente che impedisce il contatto vivo con i valori del passato.
So in thinking about this excerpt from Giussani, many questions emerge. What are the tools that an educator puts in the proverbial child's backpack? How is a child taught to think with this critical awareness? In what ways can a teacher or parent cultivate their own freedom? These are questions that we've invited our panelists to help us to unpack. However, there is a preceding question worth looking at first. Are Giussani's thoughts on education, the methods that he bequeathed us, are they relevant here and now? Are his ideas capable of educating minds and hearts in a world that seems to care more about teaching 21st century skills and reduces knowledge to a positivistic analysis of data points? Can Giussani help us to educate young people today? In my experience, the answer to this question is a resounding yes. Over the course of last fall, I worked with a number of GS students from across the country on an exhibit about the life and thought of Father Giussani. I'll share some of their words, speaking in response to Giussani's insistence that faith must be relevant to life's needs. Each of the quotes from the students below gives flesh to Giussani's statement that to say that faith exalts our reason is to say that faith corresponds to the fundamental and original needs of the human heart. Ella, a freshman in Rockville, Maryland, stated, "GS expects more from my life because it makes me see that everything matters. Getting up in the morning and going through the motions is not enough. I'm not always sure of what I'm ultimately looking for, but I want to share experiences together with my friends, and I want these experiences to have a meaning. In other places, Jesus is talked about as a historical figure. He is distant. GS is more interesting because we can experience God through the lives that we share. Jesus is a person whom I can know in reality. I'm looking for something, and he's going to show me." Anthony from South Carolina, Greenville, wrote, "I would say that my faith was a foreign part of my life before GS. I was a good Catholic, but going to Mass and talking about my faith always felt like something separate from normal life. GS taught me to recognize this deep absence in my heart, a great longing that pointed to God. Without recognizing this absence, Christ can only help me when I die. Now I want to know who is he to me right now, while I try to make myself happy. Once I realized that the emptiness and desire for something more would follow me everywhere, then my faith was no longer foreign. I can now truly say that I need Christ, not just to save me sometime in the future, but because without him, I feel alone in the world and my own plans for happiness." Now, these words were the fruit of a long work that I did with these students, preparing the exhibit, and actually some of the panels are on display here. And from accompanying these students and looking at the works of Giussani, I could see just how relevant his method was. The work became a perfect parallel to how Giussani proposes the education of young people. You introduce them to a shared history, a life, a tradition, a community, a charism. Accompany them while they allow these provocations and claims to percolate. Trust them as they eventually are prompted to evaluate this proposal against the horizon of their own desires as they ultimately arrive to a deepened understanding of both themselves and the faith. I'll conclude with just one final quote from a student. It's my friend Maddie in Crosby, Minnesota. And it points to the interesting and perhaps unexpected title for tonight's event, "A Friend on the Road to the Mystery." She shared, "The movement was born from Father Giussani's love for the destiny of young people. He wanted us young people to fall in love with our lives and to understand the purpose and the reasonableness of the Catholic Church and our faith. Learning about how GS came to be, while I'm personally following GS, is incredible. As I learn about Father Giussani's life, it's like Father Giussani is telling me that he is in love with my destiny. He feels like my friend. He's never been so real to me. I'm actually blown away. Reading his biography makes me fall in love with communion and liberation and Father Giussani. It's crazy. I'm blown away by all that we have. If it wasn't for this man, this friend, who, by the way, is the most passionate, interesting, and in-love man I've ever met, I'm not sure where I would be. Reading about his life makes you experience the weight of the gift of GS for our lives." So I'll return to that quote from Giussani. "Reality is to education as destination is to journey. Father Giussani is indeed a friend who has accompanied many of us on the road to the mystery. He is a father who has educated us." To learn more about Giussani's distinctive approach to education, I'd now like to welcome our first speaker to the stage. Tim O'Malley is the Director of Education at the McGrath Institute for Church Life and Academic Director of the Notre Dame Center for Liturgy. You'll find his biography with more information about his many accomplishments in the program you received, but please help me to welcome Tim to the stage.
Thank you so much for being here this evening, and thank you so much for the kind welcome. Ideology, as Don Giussani notes in The Religious Sense, is a preconception that takes up but one dimension of reality, one aspect of truth, and deforms it as an absolute. In this sense, an ideology becomes a blinder that enables us to perceive the world but in a single way. Only this scientific theory can explain reality. Only this economic proposal, only this. Catholic formation, a broader term that for me will include education within the schools, but life within our parishes and in the home and in the world, in the last 25 years has suffered from this ideological blinding. The inability to think about Catholic formation is the result of a certain exaggerated account of experience. In this account, experience is at odds with the language of tradition or doctrine. The important thing is that people have an experience, not that they believe in something so arcane as the Trinity, understand Catholic social doctrine, or grasp the rudiments of Christian history. Texts and ideas are but ciphers to the true source of education, the category of experience. This approach to experience has influenced, especially in theology, Catholicism's understanding of revelation. The ideology of experience enters the very account of divine revelation. Every man or woman must measure the truth of the Christian event according to my experience. If my experience is different than what the tradition proposes, then the tradition will need to be changed, augmented, or left behind for the sake of my experience. This kind of critical correlation becomes the privileged method of the Christian theologian. Divine revelation and human life critique one another and hold the same standard. My life will tell Christian tradition what's better. After all, it's just Jesus. That was a joke. And Christian tradition will have something to say to my life, but it's up for me, the individual, to determine what that saying will be. Of course, there are massive problems with this account of experience. It passes over the meaning of what experience is. Experience is not a category that's distinct from tradition, from that which is proposed to us. To be human from the beginning is to have experiences, not to have experiences apart from the rest of our lives. It's to see, taste, touch, feel, smell, conceive, grasp, understand, imagine, remember, and will. All of this is part of human experience, human sensio in Latin. And therefore, there's never an encounter with the tradition that is not already an experience for the person who engages in this encounter. When we proclaim that God is love, the very utterance is already in an experience. When we proclaim the preferential option for the poor, that itself is an experience. The other problem is that it places individual experience as the primary referee for the entire tradition. It's the isolated monad who becomes the prime judger of the tradition. You get to determine what's in or what's out. It's assumed that tradition is simply a series of ideas that the knower can construct or deconstruct on his or her own. Yet, the tradition is not that. It's already an echo of the wisdom that comes down from that person of Christ, that reality of Christ, that event of Christ through the ages. It's the result of a common experience that precedes the individual. In this sense, the individual must encounter what's proposed within the tradition, but the individual must understand that the encounter is itself of the individual person with the community that precedes them. Of course, this ideology of experience is not the only blinder found in Christian education or formation today. Some years ago, I remember a good priest saying that good catechesis, good Catholic education was akin to teaching a parrot to speak. I have no experience in teaching a parrot to speak, though I imagine it's a rather sort of, habitual task. The parrot is to repeat after the one speaking, memorizing everything, gaining the capacity to say the tradition, the text, the idea, but no thinking of it. Dear friends, I'd like to make the most controversial of claims. Human beings are not parrots. The young child, even the infant, doesn't just learn to speak without thinking, without giving their body over to the act of speaking. The young child learns to speak because he or she gazes upon the mouth of the beloved mother or father. They see the movement of lips. They take up the texts that are important, even sacred for the mother and father. My children, for example, are both expert chanters of Marian Latin texts at the ages of 6 and 2, not because we have proposed them in a formal Latin curriculum, but because we just happen to sing. And they like our mouths. They pay attention to what we say. Experience and tradition, love and word are united from the very beginning. Don Giussani's educational proposal offers a way out of this bifurcation between experience and tradition, between love and text. He does so not by pursuing a via media, a middle way, emphasizing that we need both love and text, the experience and the tradition. Instead, he actually understands what education is. It's an education around an encounter with the mystery of reality. It doesn't unfold apart from a tradition, a series of hypotheses given to us by men and women who proposed this tradition for us, given to us by Christ himself. The encounter with reality is never experienced as an isolated monad, but always in a communion of inquiry, a series of friendships that enable us to face the real. We hear this most fully in The Risk of Education. Giussani writes, every single element of the essential dynamism of the educational trajectory is undeniably marked by reality. Its perspective, its modalities, and its fabric of interconnections. Reality shapes this trajectory and dominates it. It shapes it from its origin, and it dominates it as the end. Any educational method that maintains even a modicum of loyalty to evidence must both recognize and in some ways engage with this reality. The educational act, the act of formation, does not relate first or foremost to either experience or tradition. It's about facing reality for what it is, to see the gift of existence as gift. This means to know, to be reasonable. In this way, of course, the tradition, the text, the hypothesis offered by the authority of our forebears, embodied in the life of the teacher, has a proposal for us. We're not searching for this reality on our own. The text that comes to us, the doctrines given to us, all of those orient us toward the real. At times, they may be the only thing that can orient us aright. After all, we could gaze at the world, couldn't we? See what is around us. See New York traffic. See New York anger, of which I, as a Midwesterner, see most acutely, and come to the conclusion that there is no meaning. Human beings are made for conflict, power, prestige, and ultimately destruction. That's a dark view of New York. Or we could be told that God is love. God is love. That the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and that would change the orientation of everything. It'd change everything. If it's true, if it's coherent, then it changes all. It even redeems New York. Sorry. As a Midwesterner, I feel obliged. What's the authority that would enable one to claim this? After all, there are competing claims. Not everyone believes the Word became flesh. Not everyone believes the world is oriented towards love. The task in this instance is to embody in the life of the educator, in the life of the community of the church, even in the life of the family, that this hypothesis is total. It affects every dimension of what it means to be human, every dimension of everything ever. And the teacher, the parent, the figure of authority is not excluded from this account of encounter. After all, the teacher and the parent are not bestowing a reality to the student that they've mastered. I'm shocked again and again how much when I teach Augustine's Confessions, how much I fall in love with the God who made me to rest in God alone. Together we face reality, seeing anew what the gift of existence could mean. Here, I just want to conclude with two little stories to show what this act of education can mean. The first relates to a trip to even this very day to the cloisters, and the second, an encounter with a dead bird. So from the sublime, well, to the sublime. Today, I went to the cloisters reading Don Giussani as I went along. In the strangest of settings, a kind of medieval paradise captured in northern Manhattan, I saw altarpieces, relics, statues of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Christ Child, and many more things. In gazing at these images, I wasn't just having a sort of isolated experience, nor for that matter was I simply thinking. I took time, I stayed, I dwelled, I looked. It was an encounter with reality, an education that was informed by an experience that was given unto me, that was itself a hypothesis. There were many who wandered around the cloister for a variety of reasons. Some were looking at nice plants, others because they wanted to see the gardens, others because they liked to look at famous things, others because there was a child who enjoyed the string that one could pluck in front of the exhibits that meant you were getting too close. Each, in essence, were having an encounter. But to the one who came in aware of the proposal at the heart of the cloisters that the Word did become flesh, one saw a series of educational acts performed for me by people I've never met from the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. The way the Blessed Virgin Mary looked at her dying son gave to me an experience of what it means to die. It offered me something to see, a provocation that forced me to ask where my gaze is directed. An act of education was being performed without a formal teacher except that material culture, that hypothesis that came to me. But the authority of the place, including the many steps that led up to it, allowed me to face reality, to see what was proposed. It is my task, in the midst of my ecclesial community, in my family, in my polis, to put this into practice. Also, last week, my son and I encountered a dead bird. It was a baby, fallen from its nest on our driveway. My family made it very clear that it was my job to remove this bird. They made it very clear. As we lifted the bird in its sort of formal sort of funeral carrier, which in this case was a shovel, it became an occasion to talk to my son about the meaning of death. We talked about the bird. We prayed for the bird. We talked about creation. We talked about care and respect to treat those who have died, even baby birds that fall from nests. And we explained in the essence to our family the nature of this encounter. These kinds of encounters, if we are aware, come to us day after day after day, minute after minute after minute. Such an act of education is never exclusively a matter of experience, nor a matter of tradition alone. It's a facing of reality, of seeing what it is. Dare I say that the cultural renewal in our time will need to become an occasion not of a kind of cultural traditionalism that just says if we repeat the text again, it will be sufficient. We must invite men and women, the entire human family, to face the real, the reality for us that is the enfleshment of the Word. There will be texts and ideas involved in this practice, but there will also be a mutual seeking of love, together, in families, in schools, in subways, on street corners, and even in driveways with dead birds. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. John Zucchi. Dr. Zucchi is professor and past chair in the Department of History and Classical Studies at McGill University and former senior editor at McGill Queen's University Press. Again, please look at your program for a full biography. Welcome, John.
Thanks very much. I'm both humbled and grateful to be here this evening. Humbled, well, because I've been asked to speak about myself and my experience with of being educated by Father Giussani, and grateful for this as well because it makes me take stock of that whole experience. There's a passage in the Gospel of St. John that always strikes me whenever I read it or hear it. It is when Christ appears to some of the apostles after the resurrection, and they've been fishing all night. Jesus asks them if they have caught anything, and they reply that they have not. So he tells them to throw the net to the starboard, and they will catch something. The apostles are not able to haul the net because of the quantity of fish. St. John, the writer of the Gospel, recognizes the Lord and tells Peter. Peter, who had nothing on, ties his outer garment about him and jumps into the water. In the meantime, the other disciples come close to the shore with the boat towing the net. Jesus asks them to bring some of the fish they've caught, and Simon Peter goes on board, takes the net, and drags it to shore. Now, here is what always sticks out for me when I read the passage. It is not by any means the most important question, far from it. John lets us know that there are 153 fish in the net. Isn't it curious that he should have noted this? Some biblical scholars suggest that the number 153 might be symbolic. Let's suppose that the disciples had merely counted the fish. What were they doing? The most significant being in their lives was standing before them. Peter was astounded to see the Lord. He also bore the shame of his denial 3 times as Christ went to his death. We're about to enter the famous dialogue in which Christ asks Peter if he loves him, and the disciples are counting fish. Evidently, John still finds the fact significant enough to report it in what becomes the 4th Gospel many years later. But isn't it odd that in the face of that man who drew them ever deeper into mystery, the infinite, into something else, beyond, unimaginable, the disciples should have been worrying about such finite matters as how many fish were in the nets? Were they trying to measure the greatness of that instant with Christ with another yardstick? Perhaps. It's also striking that John should find that insignificant detail significant enough to relate it as a very old man. Perhaps it was a kind of detail which served as an entry point, a way of quickly recalling the much more significant event of that encounter that morning with Christ. In a sense, that's what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to tell you about some insignificant, banal details, which, however, bear their own significance. Of the many moments I had to meet Father Giussani in person, through books or through others, the few episodes I will tell you have no great significance on the one hand, but they are crucial for me, and that they are reference points by which I remember key ways in which Father Giussani educated me. I was 28 years old when I came across Father Giussani. I did not meet him directly, but through a friend and a group of friends. From what they told me, I knew that he was someone very intelligent. They certainly spoke about him with great enthusiasm. I had always grown up in the faith, but had never really had fundamental reasons for that faith. In the months before I met Luigi Giussani, I had the sense that I might leave the faith eventually. Here was my dilemma. There was a disconnect between the life I was living and the way of the world. I loved that world. I still love it. I was attracted to many people within it. I had grown up in it. But in a certain sense, I was like a spectator in that world, a visitor. The only solution I could find was to live a very personal, individualistic, consumer type of Catholicism. How odd, because that made me a kind of visitor in what was supposed to be my home world. I did not have to choose or commit to anything or anyone. I could manage my faith life, my moral life, my prayer life, etc., and not need to develop relationships that deeply informed the way I lived every aspect of life. That could not hold up in the long run. I distinctly remember thinking, well, perhaps that's the way things are. One grows up, gets an education, and then is guided by other principles. In all this, I felt a certain unease. I recall I had a very urgent need to meet true friends with whom I could speak about things that truly mattered. Perhaps I perceived deep down that something had to break through that modus vivendi, that mindset with which I faced life. This occurred in 2 steps. First of all, the first step, those friends I met when I was 28 years old were so different from other people I had ever met. Here I was, a Catholic for many years, and I thought I knew so much about the faith, about the church, about Christ, about the Gospels. And there were these people that I had met who did not seem to know a great deal about the Gospels. Rather, they seemed to identify with the life of the Gospels. They seemed to partake in that life. When I would ask them why that was, they referred to this friendship they lived that began with Father Giussani. This experience was fundamental for me, but it did not yet convince me that Father Giussani was anything more than a very intelligent priest. But here's the second step, which was very fundamental for me, I'd say. I fell in love with one of the first people I met, the one who struck me the most for her way of being. The problem was she had chosen to follow a particular vocational path of commitment to Christ that involved the celibate life. She spoke to Father Giussani, telling him that she too was in love, and she told him that she would keep a distance from me, and to do so would even change some of her career plans. Father Giussani suggested to her that changing her career plans might not resolve anything, and that ending the friendship with me wouldn't either. He suggested that she go deeper into a friendship with me, but always with a consideration for her ultimate vocation. I could not believe that a priest could say this. I had been expecting him to warn my friend to avoid the relationship because it might thwart her vocational path. That's what I expected a priest to do, to react in a moralistic fashion. I still had not met Father Giussani, but I already understood that moment that this man was not merely intelligent. There was something exceptional about him that I could not put my finger on. I also understood 2 things that day: that woman had to follow her vocation, and I could not be an obstacle on her path, or to her path. Secondly, I understood in my heart of hearts that the path that Father Giussani had traced, this strange movement, communion liberation, was a path for me. It was not only that questions that I had about my life, about the purpose of this life, its meaning, my desires, that all this saw the possibility of a response, finally. It was also that the questions and the desires seemed to grow ever greater. So I'd made a decision for my life, not formally, but in an existential way, if I can put it that way. Then I had my life to live. I did not tell you earlier that my encounter with those friends took place while I was doing a 2-year postdoc in Cambridge, England. I came back to Canada and desired to continue to live the same life upon my return. I remember asking Father Giussani about this. I had all sorts of ideas for quote-unquote starting a community, and I shared them with Father Giussani, who I thought might appreciate them and even give me some more. I still blush when I think about all this. He was kind, but it was clear he could not care less about those ideas. He just repeated the same thing a few times. Do this or do that, the ideas I suggested to him, only if it makes you happy. That's all he could tell me. To put it another way, do what corresponds with your heart. Here I was, organizing, counting those 153 fish, while he was telling me simply to follow my heart. And so I started my university career simply enjoying, loving the new work of teaching, the work of research and writing, and I began to meet people with whom I began to share the same path. But I needed reminding along this path. I would speak to Father Giussani on the phone from time to time, and when I told him that the community had begun in Montreal, he enthusiastically said that he was going to be in the States in a few months, and he would come and visit me. I thought this was a golden opportunity to organize public talks with him, invite all sorts of people to listen to him, etc. I began working at this project and then called him one day to tell him about what I had done. My goodness, was he irritated with me. He told me that he did not want to do any public meetings. I am coming for you, he repeated. I'm only coming to visit you. What a shock that was for me. He was coming for me. Who was I? I was this guy organizing things all the time, full of plans and projects. But he wasn't coming for that fellow. He was coming for me. It raised a question in me. Who was I? Who am I that I should be loved in this way? It also raised the question for me of who that man was. I did not really know much about him. yet he was a father to me, and that relationship with him allowed me to have a glimpse of something else, someone else, as I never had before. I had the fortune of seeing him quite often in the following years, despite the fact that geographically we were far apart. I would perhaps see him 2 or 3 times a year and speak with him on the phone every few weeks or months, depending on the year and on his health. I was educated by Father Giussani during those years, first of all, by living the life of the church through the movement of CL. The friendship with Father Giussani had made me understand that the things that I had learned through him, through his writings, and through the life of the community could only be tested in a locus, in a dwelling place, by participating in the life of the community. At best, on my own, without a dwelling place, I would be merely organizing things, counting fish, as it were, and not seeing their import for my life. When I would see Father Giussani in those later years, I had the clear sense that he was guiding me ever deeper into understanding that everything in life spoke about the mystery of Christ, about his mysterious presence. He also made me understand how, in all of this, there was nothing more important than my life, or better still, than my I, because I was relationship with that mystery. It was as if he were gradually bringing me to another world, another horizon. He did not teach me this as a kind of lesson. He simply communicated it to me through his life, in a relationship, with simple words, with a kind attention to me, or with a simple gesture. Let me tell you about a couple of these episodes. One was in November 1996. I was in Milan for a conference, and I went to see him at his office. I waited for perhaps 2 hours to see him, but he was busy with someone else, and in the end, asked his secretary to ask me if I could meet him for lunch the next day instead. I was thrilled, a chance to stay with him a bit longer. I went to see him the next day for lunch and was asked to wait for him in his library, where a little dining table had been set up. He walked into the room weeping and asked me to forgive him for having made me wait so long for him the previous day. I told him that, on the contrary, I was so happy to be able to see him for lunch instead. He embraced me for what was probably a minute, but seemed like a half hour. And in the midst of this embrace, he once again asked me to forgive him because he was a bit emotional, as he had received some difficult news that day. And then in the midst of that embrace, he said, "I think I can understand a bit of what must have been the nature of the relationship between Jesus and St. John." This was a decisive moment for me for a number of reasons, which became clear to me not in the instant, but in contemplating them over the years. I mentioned earlier that I could never breach the divide between two worlds, the world of my faith and the world out there. My freedom was hampered by this outlook. The Word is made flesh, but only in the private sphere, which means effectively that it never happened. Father Giussani opened a path for me. Nothing needed to be left out or censured. Everything reminded him of Christ's presence. Even a simple embrace with a nobody could remind her of that relationship between Jesus and John. And so it became simpler for me to live my day-to-day life. I grew to love my work, my students, my colleagues, my research ever more. Dull administrative tasks were no longer thus, for they too were something asked of me, and which could help me to glimpse someone else, the way Giussani had done in that embrace. This became fundamental for my life, and I am forever grateful to Father Giussani for this. I remember that when I began my university career, I thought that I would be washed out in my later years of teaching and research. How long could all that go on? And here I find myself in the final years of my career, and I've never been happier or more enthusiastic about teaching and research, about my relationship with students and colleagues, and this is no small thing. In that embrace with Giussani, I also learned one other important lesson. The way Father Giussani was with me that day, he was with everyone at all times. For him, I was everything in that instant. But he was like that with everyone, the person in front of him. Everyone represented for him the presence of the mystery, drew him to the mystery in the instant. And gradually, with a million shortfalls on my part, I was able to understand that this ideal he lived was possible for me as well. In my relationship with my wife, my children, friends, colleagues, students, street people, maintenance workers, handymen, neighbors, that in the instant, in a relationship with someone, it is possible to detect a correspondence that reminds me of an other with a capital O. As Father Giussani drew me ever deeper into his perception of mystery, into the relationship with God, he made me ever more aware of who I was, of my dignity. And it was never a theoretical proposition, but a realization that came through in the relationship. I remember once I expressed to him my unease at having a responsibility in the movement of CL, that I was only discovering how great this experience of the movement was and how I was really ignorant about it, knew nothing about it. He looked at me very seriously and said, "No, you intuited everything at the beginning, that is with the encounter. You have the rest of your life to understand it." This struck me because it made me understand that indeed when I had my encounter in England years before, I indeed had intuited everything in an instant. The perception that the mystery of the Incarnation was not just an idea, but something that had reached me, had become clear then. That I should have had that perception was to have reached another, as it were, level of knowledge. But because it was so deep and mysterious, the rest of my life would be dedicated to testing it, verifying it in my everyday life. This allowed for a new tenderness for myself. Despite all my shortcomings, sin, miserliness in my outlook, selfishness, I, like any human being, was still that point that could become aware of mystery, that could be in relationship with that mystery. The last time I encountered Father Giussani was on August the 25th, 2004, a few months before his death. My wife and I went to see him, and he was very frail at that point. I could barely speak. I have never said publicly what he told me because I thought it was too personal. And yet now I feel that I can say what were his last words to me. Because in fact, what he said to me is what he said in his heart of hearts to every person he met, as I now say it to you. I could not understand what he was saying because his voice was so weak then, but he repeated 3 times the phrase, "The heavens will rejoice that you existed." It is like an echo of St. Irenaeus, "The glory of God is man fully alive." That phrase has been like a final testament for me from Father Giussani. A reminder that that little detail that I might be, like those 153 fish, is more than an insignificant detail. My wife often reminds me of Father Giussani's phrase when I get up on the wrong side of bed. How can you be that way when a saint said that to you? It's true, when we know that we are loved to the point that one should even remind us of it, how it changes us. I can commit 1,000 wrongs, but nothing can erase the new affection and tenderness for myself if I stay in that relationship. This was all made possible only because someone loved me in such a deep way that along the long path of friendship, he made me aware of how much the Creator loved me by willing me into existence. Thanks.
Thank you so much to both of you for your comments. We'll go ahead and launch right into a short question and answer, even though there are many, many questions that I would like to ask. But Tim, I think that I'll start with you. It occurred to me listening to your comments that to face anything ideologically would be precisely to be on-free. You have to be very rigid in adhering to this system that seems to exist. And instead you say that education, particularly in the faith, allows us to face reality as it is. And there's actually a great deal of freedom that's implied here. Regardless of the circumstances, one can be free and able to face reality. This is very interesting in the context of education. I think of myself as a high school teacher, and I would imagine the two of you as university professors see a growing amount of anxiety in students, an inability to face reality. And I think that this concept of freedom is really important to that. In the video clip I watched of Giussani, he references the concept of freedom, that for an educator to propose a tradition, they themselves need to be free. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about what is this concept of freedom within Giussani's educational proposal, and how might that be cultivated?
Yeah, so let me begin with my students as a sort of concrete sort of form of this. And actually, in some ways, the sort of greatest ideology that they're faced with is that they're not free. That actually they have been given a task by nature that they cannot break apart from. I teach this course on marriage and family, which is now at 250 undergraduates, which was a bit of a surprise on my part, because we're basically reading a history of Christian texts on marriage and family. It's not, the quote-unquote sexiest of topics. And yet, what I find is that they feel forced into careers that they have been taught through their parents sometimes, through certainly my own university at times, that the purpose of an education is some sort of free-floating signifier of excellence, success, something like that. And they feel like they can't do anything beyond that. And so, for me, this freedom, which you find in Giussani, and you find in John Paul II, and you find in Blondel, Blondel, who inspired both John Paul II and Giussani, this sense that the human person can act, and that our lives are not determined, and that actually our actions have a meaning in the world. There's a sort of freeing action in this, and we can act and be free in this and move and have our being in a distinctive kind of way. And so how do I do this with my students? Often it's challenging, it's asking them to examine the very cultural conceptions they think they have. A number of them will say, well, I must be very old before I can start a family because I cannot afford it. And the question I always ask them is, how much does it take to raise a kid? And I don't ask them how much it takes to send your kid to preschool on the Upper East Side, but I say, how much does it take to raise a kid well, to educate a kid? And it challenges them to say, well, perhaps this actually is a possibility. And so in that sense, the act of education is a freedom because it forces them to examine their ideologies and to recognize that the world that they assume is true is not actually the world as it is. And I always am very particular with this and experiential. I describe my own life with my kids, my family. I want them to see that this is the freeing life, that you can actually live this life. And in that sense, I as a professor break down all sorts of boundaries I'm not technically supposed to break down. I'm not supposed to be this subjective, this committed to the personal life, and yet suddenly they see that I am.
John, I wonder if you can comment on that as well, because I can't think of a greater experience of freedom than to be told by someone that you know so deeply loves you that the heavens will rejoice that you existed. So how did Father Giussani help you to discover your own freedom?
I was actually going to comment, actually, if you don't mind, on this point. I should tie it to what Tim was just saying, if you don't mind. Actually, I was struck by what Tim was saying about the students and how they have their own conceptions of what they should or shouldn't be doing, you know, and getting married at 40, whatever. But reality is not that. Was Tim's response? I was thinking how, in fact, it's even true when it comes to helping students in their own work, studies, research. You know, I teach history, obviously, and I do social history a great deal, and we're looking at the past. And students will try to devise all sorts of theories, ways, approaches to understanding the past. But I'm always reminding them, this is not, your idea of the past isn't reality itself. Reality is much greater than any idea you might have of that past. As you see, in the same way they have these ideas of the future, which is not reality. Also, the ideas of the past don't really represent it, that past also is a mystery. That was one way in which Father Giussani helped me a great deal in my own research. And I try to pass this on to my own students as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I was also curious, certainly, John, you spoke very much of education as a relationship between you and Father Giussani. To be educated by Father Giussani was to be in relationship with him. And certainly, Tim, you've also now spoken a great deal about your relationship with your students. And I was wondering if both of you could comment, because education is so relational, and we've spoken about some of the fruits for students, what might some of the fruits be for educators, for teachers? And I know, Tim, you alluded to this, that when you're teaching Augustine to your students and helping them to discover that piece of reality, that it becomes new for you again. But I would love to tease that out a little bit more. What are the fruits of education of this method from Father Giussani for the teacher?
No, that relationship is fundamental. It's just. In fact, I don't know if I put it precisely in these words, but I almost tell students often that the material we're studying is is more of a pretext for a deeper relationship, and also for them to help them also in looking at their own lives in a deeper way. I can't, one of the things, for example, that I really hammer away at with my students is that if they want to take my class, they have to be there. They simply have to be there. They can't sit there and watch a video of a class afterwards. Because I don't do videos for classes, so they can't watch me afterwards. I want them to be there because I want them in that relationship. I ask them at the beginning of term to come and see me because I want to meet each one of them, because I want each one of them to know that they are not merely a student in my class, that they are first of all human beings, and that therefore in a relationship I want to know who they are, I want to know where they're from, I want to know about them, I want them to know that I am interested in them because I am interested in them. I've been loved in that way, and I want to approach my students in that very, very same way, because any discovery I've made, whether it's in life or in teaching or research, whatever, it's always been made as the fruit. It's always emerged as the fruit of a relationship I've had with someone else. Someone else kind of drawn me back and allowed me to see the bigger picture. On this point, do you mind if I just tell another anecdote about Father Giussani? I always remember once, there was one fellow I knew that I was very close to, and we'd meet. He left Montreal many years ago, but we used to meet quite often, and we used to have these very, very deep conversations that would move me very much. And I went to see Father Giussani about this once, and I said to him, Father Giussani, I had these conversations with this fellow, and it seemed as if we go deeper and deeper into the mystery, that we delve ever deeper into the mystery in these conversations. And Father Giussani said, oh, you experienced that too? And of course, I started to laugh. Immediately I said, well, listen, whatever I experienced is nothing like what you must experience. And he looked at me very seriously and said, the only reason that you experienced that is because you're not a priest. And I said, what? I said, what do you mean by that? And he goes, because that vocation was not asked of you. He said, you have a particular vocation that was asked of you. Living your vocation gave you this possibility of delving deeper into the mystery. So that being able to either as students understand a subject matter better, or as human beings to have a deeper relationship with that mystery, is not the result of some technical ability, so some little plan, some little theory you can put into practice. But there's always that relationship that's involved. It's always a relationship that is involved, and it's connected to everything else out there, including our vocation, obviously.
I think the biggest surprise for me as a teacher is certainly, we gather around texts, and I learn from my students quite literally around texts. They have brilliant insights, and I grow to appreciate them more and more. But the greatest gift to me as a teacher in the last 6 years it's made me a better dad, and I've paid attention to that. My students have taught me how to be a dad, because when you become a dad, both our children are adopted, and so we had very little time to know that they were coming at all. But even when you become a dad, you have very little preparation time insofar as the child is a sort of abstraction for you, and then the child exists. And then the child is there, and you don't really know what you're doing. And what I found is that I became a better dad through listening to my students and sitting with them through their anxiety, right? Like, I was formed to initially presume that when they came to office hours, that my job was to help them fix their problem with their work. Now I'm happy to just be there with them as they talk for 15 to 20 minutes about their life and ask me about this girl they're dating or this guy they're dating, and they don't know what's going to happen with it. I just sit there with them and give a bit of advice, but mostly sort of be a person who's ahead of them, and I'm okay with that. And likewise, my own children taught me to be a better teacher because I used to sort of secretly rejoice in terrible grades. I mean, as any teacher knows, right? Like you think like, at last I come to give you the judgment you deserve. And what I've actually learned through my kids is patient with my students. And so what's so shocking to me as a teacher is how much I've learned to be human and to be both a better dad and a better teacher mutually together with one another through the attention to dwelling with, to communion.
Actually, this is leading me to my next question, because it's beautiful that this process of education and to be thinking of this method of relationship as education allows experiences to become new. And so to educate your children allows the experience of teaching your students to become new. Teaching your students allows the experience of being a father in some ways to become new. And this newness is something that both of you also touched on in your remarks. This possibility of always encountering reality in a different way, the way that it's given to us in these particular set of circumstances on this particular day, and allowing ourselves to be impacted by that really means that everything can always be new. We can think of the past in a different way than we had expected. We can think of the future in a different way than we expected. How does this newness become a new awareness for us? How do we remain open to always being challenged, to change, to convert, to accepting this newness that's implied in Father Giussani's method?
Wow. Listen, there's two things come to mind for me. One is that the newness is not possible if I don't have a place where I can belong, depend. The newness. How can I put it? I become very reductive about anything new that enters my life, unless I perceive myself as belonging to something ever greater. There's this passage from J.D. Salinger. I always love Du Maurier Smith's Blue Period. It's a short story by him where someone asks, he's an art teacher teaching art by correspondence, and he asks these three students to send him their pictures, and two of the students send some crazy photographs themselves in strange poses. And the third student is a nun, and she sends a picture of her convent. And I thought this is the most beautiful expression of belonging. I think that because when one belongs, at least when I find that when I perceive myself as belonging to specific people, the ways I depend on this relationship with Father Giussani, with my friends in the community, for example, they allowed me constantly to raise my gaze and not to, constantly either construct or reduce the newness of my life, but to recognize it for what it was.
For me, the world would be a series of disintegrated random moments every day if I didn't have a center. And for me, that center is that memory of the church that I ground myself in through prayer, specifically the hours, liturgy of the hours. And the fact that I can recognize the newness that occurs each day as part of a divine providential plan, as part of a divine story, because I ground myself in that which is not new, right? If everything was new, then my life would be dreadfully disconnected. But actually, because I ground myself in habits and ritual practices that actually enable me to have a grounding, right? I've prayed the same Psalms 1,000,000 times over. And yet, every time I pray these Psalms, they bring me back into, they reawaken me to the newness that could happen that day. So without that grounding in that which is old, the newness would be random. But with the grounding in the old, in the memory, the newness is a sign of divine life unfolding here and now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. In our discussion tonight, we've barely scratched the surface of what Giussani has to offer the topic of education today. There's always something more to discover. So with that being said, I'd really like to thank both Tim and John for joining us, and I'll ask for a round of applause while I go to the podium to make my final announcements for Crossroads.